focus today is well-being washing. What on earth is that? We're going to find out in a minute. But firstly, let me introduce Miriam Reason, founder and director of Reason. Miriam, hello.
Hi, thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Before we dive into that topic, do you want to just say what you do at Reasonful?
Thank you for having me, James. It's really good to be here. Reasonful is a consultancy supporting SMEs with all things mental health and wellbeing, and typically mental health and wellbeing strategy.
And there is so much going on in the mental well-being, mental health space these days. When we spoke the other day, I had the delight of seeing Miriam speak somewhere else recently. We said, hang on, can people get confused? Which is why we're talking about mental, get it right myself, mental being washing today. Because I think there's almost so much great advice. There's also a load of noise going on. And I want your help, ideally, Miriam, to kind of break through that so leaders listening into this can properly support their teams and not inadvertently add to the anxiety, which I guess could happen. So look, we've put it out there, mental being washing. What is it?
So, wellbeing washing. You might recognize it as a slightly adjusted version of greenwashing, and that's probably a more commonly known term. It's doing the rounds right now. I'm not sure who coined wellbeing washing, but it's here. And it essentially is when companies talk the talk around mental health and wellbeing strategy, but they're not walking the walk. That's probably the simplest way I can put it. So there have been a couple of studies done in recent times by various consultancies, big and small. And one of them, I think it was by a company called Claro Wellbeing. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. They found that about a third of companies are wellbeing washing, not necessarily on purpose. I think the intent is often quite good, but a great example might be one of the stats that they quoted. 7 in 10 workplaces celebrate the mental health awareness weeks, days. Only 3 in 10 offer mental health support that's deemed kind of good quality and helpful. And so I'm always interested in how these numbers were got to. That information isn't always easily available, but I think they're really interesting statistics that kind of speak to, I guess, how different the outward messaging can be around this versus the internal experience of an employee at a company. So for me, wellbeing washing is all about kind of flagging to leaders and to companies that this is a thing that can happen, and just raise that awareness of really encouraging leaders and organizations to think about the initiatives that they're doing. Are they helpful? Are they impactful? Are they having the intended impact? Or is it just something that is a tick box exercise? And I guess it's important to say it's quite easy to talk about well-being washing as a binary. You're doing it, you're not doing it. You know, you're either well-being washing or not well-being washing. That it's probably much more subjective than that. The thing being, you could have a company who does no mental health support initiatives, nothing on well-being, but talks about caring about it publicly. That might be an example of this. Another example might be there are some initiatives in place and that there is quite a lot of effort going into it, but it's not actually supporting employees the way they think it might be. So it can be quite subtle, and it's kind of about navigating that, really.
What kind of things might be considered washing? How does it show up? What example?
I'll give a couple of examples. So one that I can think of, which is quite easily relatable to any of us, it does still happen. I'd like to think it's getting better, is, you know, the leader who talks about how important mental health and well-being is, but then is still calling, texting, messaging their team completely out of hours, asking for urgent work repeatedly. So that's quite an extreme example, but I just want to kind of illustrate the mechanism. And I want to distinguish as well between, so every industry and every company will have different contexts for busy times, less busy times. The nature of work can really dramatically shift depending on what like the business has going on. So for example, I'll take insurance because that's where I started my career. There are really peak periods where there's lots of renewals going on and things get really, really busy. And everyone knows that's a really busy time. The leaders know, the people working with them know. And there's almost a necessary, this is going to be really hard for a few weeks and then we'll get some time to rest and recover. That for me is a necessary part of like the cycle of work and can be worked with. But this example that I've given for wellbeing washing is kind of more about when somebody treats everything as urgent. There is no downtime. It's like a constant, we must keep going. This is urgent. This is urgent. This is urgent. And it can really feel quite intense. And so I think context is really important as well. I guess later we can get into kind of what to do about it, what not to do about it. But yeah, I think context is really important. And I think an acknowledgement of that context is important for employees as well. Even the recognition that there are going to be busier times and less busy times, and seeing that the company is kind of working with that, I think is really important as well.
As you talk through that, a word I hear a lot in business these days, and I'd love your perspective on it with your experience from the mental health angle, is resilience. When I say that, what does it conjure up from your perspective?
It's an important word. It is used a lot in this industry, in this space. I think, well, there's so many ways you can take it. I could take it as individual employees and their resilience. Are they supported well to build their resilience to the kind of stresses of work life? At the same time, a lot of the work that I do through Reasonful is around the resilience of an organization. So if you're not investing in well-being, or this isn't something that you're looking at, that is a resilience risk to your organization, because fundamentally the majority of businesses depend on people. And so if you're not looking after those people, that's a risk to your organization. So I think that's really important to call out, because sometimes well-being initiatives can be, this isn't a criticism. It's just sometimes initiatives can be overly focused on, okay, how can individuals resource themselves better? And we, the organization, we might give them tools to be more resilient themselves, but we're not willing to look at things we can do at an organizational level. That's where things like culture are really important, looking at the structures that are in place. My experience is that certainly the companies that I've worked with are really open to thinking broadly and thinking about culture and thinking about things that are in place. But it's probably not the right way to phrase it, but one of the complaints that I hear a lot on the grapevine over the years is, we don't need another workshop on if they're not going to support us in my way. So that's
a trade-off.
Yeah, I think people want to see genuine care from organizations and like a mix of different things. And if, say, workshops are great, there is a place for them. They're really important. But it can't just be that. It kind of has to be part of a holistic, sustainable, meaningful strategy, basically.
I guess there are levels. From at the top level, you raised it earlier, just awareness. So that might be, what was it, 7 out of 10 companies celebrating the day. Then another level might be education to make sure people are aware of stuff. Where do you then take it? What are the levels up from there? Because you work from people who are probably far more progressive in this area. Others, I'm sure, can learn from them.
I think the way I've always looked at this is there's kind of 3 main parts, and then there are probably other bits that slot in kind of across all of them. There's, as you say, the awareness piece is really, really important. And that's often a great starting point. If organizations haven't done this work before, that can be a really good entry point. Then you've got kind of prevention. I normally picture it as a pie, which is got prevention.
That's all right.
That can look like lots of things, but it's what measures does the organization have in place to kind of prevent harm? And that's where there's quite an interesting health and safety angle as well, in terms of what organizations are legally obliged to do as well, which I'm not an expert in, but is a really important piece. And then there's also kind of actually addressing issues when they arise. So prevention is like a reactive piece, a proactive piece. And then, dealing with issues as they arise is a reactive piece. And quite often that's happening anyway, whether an organization is actively working on mental health and wellbeing strategy in general, they are responding to issues as they arise. And then there's the awareness. So all of those 3 things kind of fit together to make this strategy work. And then there's lots of other pieces that kind of fit on top of that, like the culture at an organization. What kind of feedback loops are there for people to give their input on what they think is working well and less well. And then, of course, there's a lot of the companies I've worked with are kind of in a stage of high growth. They're kind of early stage, and that can be a really exciting, energizing environment, and it can also be very exhausting and draining, and things are changing and moving so rapidly. So kind of navigating that can be a challenge as well, especially with, you know, all of the different priorities that are kind of competing with each other in that
That
stage.
sounds really interesting. Tell us more about what you might do with in those high growth environments.
It's a good question. I think I'm trying to think of them like kind of general highlights, because I do find that lots of companies, whilst there are lots of common challenges, there's quite a lot of unique
Look,
things.
I mean, there won't be one solution, will there? So maybe let me rephrase the question. So, if I'm a leader in a high growth environment that you're talking about, what are the key questions that you might ask me to determine the right course of proactive support?
That is a great question. Thank you. I would say a big question is, how are you supporting people at the moment? And if they're not sure, then that's good information. How are you measuring or capturing data on how people are feeling, how people are feeling supported? You know, for example, if there are some initiatives in place, how useful are people finding that? And is there anything else they want to see? That's not to say that every bit of feedback that you collect you have to act on, but it's really helpful to have it, and then you can kind of have this dialogue going on. And actually, in this example, a lot of the feedback is verbal, and that's valid. You know, a lot of the feedback is, if it's a team of 5 or 10, for example, leaders generally have a good pulse on what people are thinking, but I think it's important to make sure those conversations are happening and that they're not just assuming that they know, you know, actually
And
having
when you say
conversations.
capturing data, what could that be or look like?
It could be as simple as a survey. I mean, it sounds really basic, but
Yeah.
having employee surveys that capture qualitative and quantitative data about how employees are how they're finding things, finding the balance between, obviously everyone's busy and typically people don't enjoy filling in surveys, but something that kind of meets the balance between, we want to support you, please tell us what's working, what's not working, what do you want more of, less of, so that we can kind of explore it, and kind of making it a collaborative experience for employees. At the very least, having that's an idea. And then other things that can work well are having very clear kind of feedback channels where people can, you know, outside of the survey cycle, can still have conversations about things. So that's one or two examples.
And is there anything that a leader might do? I mean, I guess surveys could help with to kind of destigmatize the whole thing. Is there anything that they can say or do to help people? Because I guess ultimately, given it's people's mental well-being we're talking about, we need to get to how people are feeling, don't we? That's the ultimate
Yeah, and I think there is.
goal here.
Yeah, there's an issue that seems to be revealed by lots of different studies, that people are still, even now, post-COVID, and with all the good work that's happening, people still feel nervous about talking about their mental health at work because of fear of negative consequences. And that is because of stigma. We know that stigma exists. And I think that can be quite a challenge to navigate. I think leaders have a real opportunity to kind of role model the kind of behavior that they would want for their organization as well. So it kind of does speak to this wellbeing washing idea that it's all very well saying that mental health is important, and it's all very well a leader kind of genuinely believing it and buying into it. But there's also something really valuable about leaders being seen to take time for their mental health, talking about what mental health means for them, talking about how important it is and meaning it, and kind of leading by example in terms of, there are some great examples, say, of working parents who don't work between 4 and 7 so they can kind of do school pickup, do dinner or whatever it is they need to do, and then they kind of log on for a couple of hours in the evening. And that kind of flexible approach, and not just employees doing it but leaders doing it as well, it gives other people in the organization the message that you don't have to fight to do this is something that we do here. Obviously every organization has their own like limitations around what they can flexibly do, but by and large, I think that there are really meaningful things that leaders can do, which are quite small, but which kind of convey the message. This is something that I also care about, that we can do. And then the other thing I would add to that is people in general, I think starting the conversation can be quite a scary thing to do. And so that's where I don't want to give the impression that raising awareness isn't important, because it's really important. Often that can be the thing that gets the conversation started and gets it going and can sustain these movements. I guess the key takeaway I would like to leave people who are watching, is what else are you doing around it? So as well as the awareness, what else do you have in place that supports that, so that it's not just talking about it, but also supporting people to have more kind of positive experiences in their work, I guess.
I love what you're saying about the role model. People forget, the leaders forget how influential what they do or seem to do has across the whole culture of a business.
Yeah, and I actually, you've just reminded me, I think being a leader is it's a high pressure place to be. There's people who really depend on you, and you're also responsible to, leadership above you or shareholders or whatever it may be. And it's very easy to get caught in a cycle of, I have all these, like, I can't take a break, I've got all this stuff to do. And it can feel like taking breaks is for other people. Like, I have to keep going, I can't stop. And so just shifting things and this is something that a lot of us, me included, still work on all the time, is looking after yourself and taking the time that you need. But it can be really easy to feel like, like they can take their time, but I can't stop, I need to keep going. And recognizing that and just shifting it to, if I don't look after myself, then what? Who will be able to do what I do? And just thinking about it in those kind of more proactive terms can be helpful for some people, because I think it's too easy to sacrifice yourself for everything else, the job, the people, whatever. But actually, this is about also recognizing our own limitations as well.
Very, very good advice, particularly for the new leaders.
Yeah.
I've worked with a lot of new leaders, and on one level, they're promoted, they've got new responsibilities. Some of them think they have to be a bit of what I call a superhero, kind of have to do everything. And they may be looking after their team's well-being really well, but to the detriment of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any advice you'd give to a new leader like that?
I'll repackage my earlier sentiment and say, looking after yourself is looking after your organization and your people. Like, it doesn't always feel that way, but it is. Not everyone struggles with that, so that might not resonate with everyone, but that would be something that I'd be very keen to share, particularly in that kind of environment where, if it's a high growth startup, for example, you're kind of responsible for so many things and got so many different stakeholders, and things feel quite, I want to say risky, but it's like things aren't stable necessarily, that they could kind of go either way.
Yeah, you're in a rapidly growing, changing environment every day.
I think even more so in those situations. And it doesn't have the thing I always say to people, and I probably said this in the workshop that we met at, is I like to think that people are experts in what they need and what works for them. And maybe this is useful from a wellbeing strategy perspective as well, at kind of a higher level, but people generally are able to really know what's going to be helpful for them, what isn't, what do they need. And so for some people, their schedule might only permit 5 minutes at the start of the day to themselves. It really depends on the context. So really empowering people to work out what it is that they need and what they are able to reasonably fit into their schedule, and kind of go from there. And so a wellbeing strategy, I think, that works also allows people in an organization to almost construct the support that they need for themselves. It's much easier the challenges look different at different size organizations, but definitely it's much harder to offer a million different things on a wellbeing menu for a small startup than it is for a big corporate, but the expectations are also different. So yeah, we'll just say that.
It starts with the people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And having those conversations. I love what you said there about yourself and what you really need. And I think there's almost a level of the manager, the leader, doing something to give you time to think and get that out.
Yeah.
Because we do know what we really need, but I would challenge and say, well, most of us don't always think about it, let alone express it.
Yeah,
let alone express it to a boss in a busy job.
absolutely. Yes, I agree completely.
I guess the permission level needs to go a lot deeper than, "Oh, tell us how you feel, move on."
Yes. And that question, is there anything you need that you're not getting at the moment? That can be a really much more specific and direct and inviting question to answer than how are you doing? Because it's so easy to say, yeah, I'm doing okay, I'm fine. But really being curious about that. And I liked what you said about giving people time as well, because I would say a lot of people would appreciate and need time to really reflect on that. It can be quite hard to give kind of instant reactions to a question like that. And maybe some examples as well. I'm quite aware that there are obviously going to be limitations to what people can receive in terms of support from organizations, but knowing that sentiment is there and that the desire to support is there, and that whilst maybe all of the things on their list that they need might not be possible, at least there is an ongoing dialogue about it.
One of the things, I don't know much about mental health. I've done a first aider course, so I know a small amount, enough to ask a question or point people in a direction. And one of the things that I discovered on there, one was the really obvious factor is, look, we all have mental health in the same way that we have physical health. And the other thing that I was reminded of particularly is, obviously it ranges from day to day. And I think there was a really good question. You could probably add some depth to this in terms of, okay, on a spectrum, how is your mental health today? Because everyone could use that question, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a good point. We all have a mind, we all have a body. It's a really useful thing to remember, and something that I try to mention in the workshops. And just in the same way that we might wake up in the morning and notice how our body feels, getting into the habit of noticing how our mind feels as well. Some people do this naturally anyway. I do think there's something to be said for inviting conversations like that at work. I also think there's probably a balance, and it's very context dependent. Some people won't want to be asked. So it's just be, as a leader, being really tuned into the individuals that you have that you're working with. And for example, if somebody is asked that once a quarter for a survey, that's a very different thing to, being asked that every single day. And some people will never want to
Yeah.
answer it. Some people will only want to answer it sometimes. And some people are very happy to be asked every single day. So I think there's something here around just, remembering how subjective all of this is and how differently different people can take it, and just being really tuned into that and responsive as well. You're never going to please everyone, but
The more normal it can become as part of everyday cultural conversation, then probably the better, yeah?
yeah, and I've had, not necessarily the clients I've worked with, but I've seen in organizations before, this is slightly off topic, but one of the CEOs did a short keynote about his experiences with anxiety and how he manages it,
Right.
and how it manifests in his life and how it's affected his career so far. And people were blown away by that. I think it probably links more to what you were asking earlier about what can leaders do. That's a really brave thing that leader did, kind of standing up and talking for 10-15 minutes about his experiences. And it helped so many people in that organization just to feel there is somebody who is in a really senior leadership position who has described going through things that I myself have gone through. It's kind of this, in diversity and inclusion spaces, there's a phrase that goes around called "you can't be what you can't see." And it can be really meaningful when you have a leader who is from a group that you're in, like a minority group, for example, and you see that they're doing it. Maybe I could do it too. And mental health, you can't really see most of the time. It's not the visible thing. So kind of making the unseen seen is really
That's a
meaningful.
really powerful concept. Particularly if we were to, go back to the kind of washing, because I don't know, a conversation, a business could tick all the boxes. They could have, consultants available to people, welfare, a whole list of stuff. But then they could really drive their drive their people hard and give it lip service.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to mention actually that there can be silos as well that come out. So you could have, and it works both ways. You could have a huge organization that offers great initiatives that are really comprehensive and they're getting a lot right. And then you could have a couple of small teams within that enormous organization where there's like a silo of culture that just really isn't working. And the team are being, like you just described, the team are in an environment that is really hard to thrive in. the opposite can be true as well. You can have an organization that actually isn't doing very much, or what it's doing isn't quite landing with people, but there is a leader who is so nurturing and so supportive and creates this culture and environment in that one team that feels so special, that gives the people what they need to kind of thrive. And I guess both are kind of, I guess, more extreme examples of the same kind of different sides of the same coin. But, you know, in instance, just being really tuned in to what are the different kind of pockets in the organization. And but I mean, that's the challenge of a CEO, really, isn't it? It's being tuned into what's going on.
It's almost a challenge out there. It's like, well, to support mental well-being in your business, where are you prepared to be vulnerable? What stories would you be okay? Let's use the word okay, because they might have to go outside their comfort zone to do this, but it could have a good, profound effect on people actually feeling safe, which I believe psychological safety is one of the biggest drivers of kind of effective teams.
Yeah, massively.
What the example you described is a fantastic example of demonstrating how it's safe.
Yeah, I really agree. Psychological safety is so important. And something that you reminded me of just then as well is the importance of one of the things I think that can really help in a situation where you're kind of trying to make sure you're not wellbeing washing is transparency and accountability. And I think people can get a lot from seeing an organization's leadership be very open about, here's what we've tried, it's not had the impact that we thought it would, or here's what we want to try, here are the things that we could do better, here's what you've told us about this, and we want to try and do better in this area. Kind of an open acknowledgement of the fact that they aren't getting it perfectly right, and that there are things that they want to.
Nice.
Actually, having said that, what is perfect? I mean, I'm always trying to remind people that, yeah, we're not striving for perfection. I think it's good enough, but yeah, acknowledging where things aren't good enough and having that open, kind of honest dialogue, I think it means a lot.
I guess the bigger the pie you described earlier, the more of that can be proactive, the better.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Nice. Let's help leaders in a different way now. I don't know. I'm not expecting a perfect answer to this one, but it's also used the other way, isn't it? So mental health could be used as an excuse. Somebody might fancy the day off, and they might say to the leader, "Blah blah blah." How do you deal with that as a leader? Have you got any tips to understand what is kind of genuine and not? Is there any guidance on that?
That's a very interesting question. I have been asked it before.
It's a difficult one. A few people have raised it with me recently.
I'm sure that it does happen, you know, that people, you know, pull a sickie, for want of a better word. But my take on it would be, you know, as a leader, you can only really go with what people are telling you. And I think the amount of stigma that there is around mental health and mental illness, if someone is telling you that's what they're experiencing, I would be inclined to believe them, because it's hard enough. There's quite a lot of, you'll probably hear the word presenteeism, for example. Absenteeism is also brought up a lot around this topic. So missed days of work because of mental ill health. And I don't remember the stats off the top of my head, but they're astronomically high, you know, the number of days lost to mental health each year. And that's just the ones that we know about, because actually my understanding of the data is that people are much more likely to not be forthcoming about a mental health issue and say it's something else, you know, I have a headache or whatever.
Okay.
That
the leader, you can't really make any assumptions.
I don't think,
You have to trust the individual.
I think so. And if over a long period of time issues arise involving that individual, then that's something that an organized, like a leader, would have to work very closely with that individual and navigate that with them. You know, if there are performance issues, exploring that, is there more that support that they need in that role? And HR are very well versed in what that process looks like. But yeah, I would be inclined to, I mean, other people may disagree, but I would be inclined to, you know, come from a position of not making assumptions and really trusting that that is what that person is experiencing.
Like your approach. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Let's go back the other way. So all of the people that are doing the proactive stuff, and you've given a few examples, what's the benefit of them? Clearly it's beneficial to the employees, but what's the benefit to the business?
So there is a headline that I usually like to give at this point when I'm asked this, which is, I wish we lived in a utopia where this work was just done because it was the right thing to do, but we don't. And what businesses and leaders are usually very interested in is the kind of value that this kind of work generates for businesses. So there's a real kind of enormous business case that comes with this work. I think kind of at a global level, McKinsey did a study recently that found it was something like between $3 and $11 trillion of value could be generated from improving employee health and well-being. Now, I appreciate that figure means next to nothing to someone running an organization of 10 people in Hertfordshire, but there are some really interesting findings. Yeah. But it sort of makes sense, right? So if employee well-being is invested in, cared about, addressed, people show up to work more engaged, more motivated, they feel more valued, productivity improves, morale improves, job satisfaction improves. There are lots of different parts to different benefits. Some of them are easier to quantify than others. Things like employer brand and reputation. Something I'm asked occasionally by leaders is, what are my competitors doing? Like, how does my organization compare to similar organizations? What's the benchmarking? Yeah. And I think it's important to say that it's important to be very contextual about where you want to be as an organization. So not every organization is going to want or need to be the top, the best of the best in terms of employee well-being and mental health strategy. That might not be every organization's goal. Some organizations just want to make sure they're doing like kind of industry standard on this. Both are valid. It's sometimes I speak to organizations who don't have anything in place at the moment and they just want to kind of get to somewhere where they are doing some things around it. So every organization's in a different stage of this journey, and organizational reputation is a factor. And then there's also kind of the other side to it, which is more around what's the cost of getting it wrong. So there's lots of business benefit. Profitability can be improved through revenue on that side of things. And before I forget, there's a stat that goes round quite frequently by Deloitte found that on average, every £1 spent on well-being generates £5 back, which kind of speaks to this and is maybe more relevant to the average business owner and leader. Yeah. But the thing that I will say is if there can be obviously like litigation costs, if businesses don't get this right, from SME all the way up to, multinational corporations. And so that's usually grabs people's interest as well. And there are organizations.
There's so much change going on, isn't there? I guess as I look at it, people, if you're an employee, you've got a couple of choices. The first choice is where you work. So obviously you might be looking at a market and seeing how people treat you. And the second choice is when you've got that job and you are at work, how much of yourself and how much value you really bring. Of course, you have to bring a certain amount, otherwise you might end up out of a job. But there's quite a lot that is optional if the environment's right.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think if leaders, if it's a win-win, really, isn't it? Between people. If people are important to your business, looking after them is going to get results.
Yeah, I think leaders can't. It will get to a place where leaders can't afford not to look at this stuff, and I think that's kind of the sentiment that's starting to happen. Is this is something that is not going to ever. It's not getting less important that way. So it's a worthy investment.
Yeah, I'd love. We are in a massive period of change at the moment. I know AI has been around for years, but it's only gone mainstream at the back end of last year. A lot of people are adapting to new work environments because COVID has encouraged a cultural shift in a lot of people working from home. And one of the things, if I dial my head back, the latest big tech change that I remember was kind of mobile phones. Because on one hand, it was a computer that was the size of whatever computer they had that took them to the moon in your pocket. So loads of benefits. But if we looked at it from a mental perspective, then it also meant that it was harder for a lot of people to step away from work and delineate between working and non-working. I'm not going to go into all the effects of mobile phones, but in a world of AI now, it's not going to go away, is my opinion. What's your perspective on the choices we could make now? So AI is a great complement to us as humans. rather than another force of mental stress and anxiety? Love your thoughts.
It's a huge question. It's a huge
Massive, isn't it?
question.
Massive.
And I could probably speak about it for hours. So I'll
So,
try and give a short response.
thank you.
I think you're right to talk about technology and the impact that that has on us as human beings and our mental health. And it's both, a mobile phone is a great example, as you said, of something that can both contribute positively to our mental health. We are able to work from anywhere, well, laptop more than a phone. We can keep in touch with family on the other side of the world, all sorts of different things. It is also the advent of stuff that can be quite harmful to mental health for many, many reasons. And when I think about AI, I'm not an AI expert, but I've seen it come up way more in recent years and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It will become part of working. And I think it's going to be really important to find that balance, like you say, kind of embracing it in ways that make sense and also putting, I guess, boundaries or limits in place where it's kind of harmful to us. I think with any kind of technological change, finding ways that technology can support our mental health and well-being and making sure that we use those and being very tuned into when it's not. This isn't an AI example because I know about it, I have used it before, it's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but with technology like mobile phones, for example, there are loads of different ideas out there in terms of how you can make technology work for you. I've worked with people who find the screen time app really, really helpful. It blocks you from using it at certain times of the day. Others don't find that useful. They talk about, I just turn that off and I'm back on the social media. A lot of those are just inbuilt in phones now. There was a trick that someone on my neuroscience course taught me of putting your screen color to black and white. Apparently that massively reduces the appeal of social media feeds because the colors aren't
Okay.
there. There's a session I do on technology and well-being, and usually people are quite surprised by that one. I do find that without the colors on the phone, it's just not as appealing to look at. And there's a phone called the boring phone. There's a few of them now, but there's a phone called the boring phone that's black and white. It only does calls, texts, I think podcasts or music, and that's pretty much it. So there's lots of different kind of creative things going on in technology that are kind of designed to be more mental health friendly, for want of a better word. But yeah, keeping on top of all of that is a huge challenge, and I can't pretend to have all the answers either.
No, I wasn't expecting it at all. But it's really interesting listening because it's almost that leaders can ask themselves the business and the people in it. It's almost if you answer those two questions always at the same time, that's going to be kind of front of mind part of culture, isn't it? Rather than a secondary thing that you then have to do
Yeah,
later on.
absolutely. And I think something you've reminded me of that I forgot to mention earlier is around it's technology, but it's also flexibility on the part of the business. It's quite popular now for people to work those flexible hours, like we talked about earlier, but to have it at the email signature, I work flexible hours. I don't expect a response at this time. Please respond whenever you're working, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Little things like that. And just being really aware that not everybody is, if it works for you to work at 8 p.m, great. You're not necessarily going to have other people who feel that way, and just acknowledging that, I guess.
Thank you so much for joining us. I reckon it won't be long before leaders are faced with the challenge of leading both AI and people.
Yes, quite possibly. Let's
So
see what
we will,
happens.
we'll come back. Who knows? Might be 2 months,
Yeah.
6 months. Maybe we'll come back and discuss that tech. Sounds fascinating. Before you
Yeah.
go, have you got a book recommendation for leaders out there?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I'm going to recommend a book that I read recently and really loved. It's not a leadership focused book at all. It's just a book that I really enjoyed. It's called A Matter of Life and Death by Irvin Yalom. He is a famous, renowned existential psychotherapist, and he talks really beautifully about his life journey and what it means to live a life and the meaning that he's got from that. And it gets quite philosophical at points, but I just really enjoyed it. And for anyone interested in mental health and well-being, and kind of meaning and life, I would recommend it.
That sounds quite deep.
Yes.
Okay,
In
well, I
parts.
won't ask you for key outtake because they're probably personal to you. But thank you very much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining. Miriam from Reason for we'll add all of the details below if you need to to speak to Miriam on anything you'll be able to reach.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks
much
for
again,
having me,
Miriam.
James. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.